Good morning, everyone. On this really wet and rainy, kind of gross, almost spring day. I welcome you to one of our 2020-2021 virtual McLean County Community Behavioral Health Forums. We are excited to have all of you here, especially bright and early at 7:30 on a Thursday morning. And I would chime in and say that if you are lucky enough to still be at home, stay there as long as possible because the wind and the rain is kind of gross. This is our fourth year of hosting the forum. I am Tricia Millott. I'm the county's Behavioral Health Coordinating Council Supervisor. And for those of you who have either watched other forum sessions or have attended in the past, this has always been a live in-person event that takes up one full day, and we try to offer between 20 and 30 different breakout sessions throughout the day. So when COVID-19 hit a year ago, our planning committee worked to restructure how we could still bring this information to the community, but in a safe way, and have found a lot of benefits in it. So the idea of the forum originates out of the McLean County Mental Health Action Plan that was approved by the county board back in 2015. And one of the charges in that document and plan is that at least on an annual basis, we make an effort to educate our community, not only on behavioral health as a general topic or specific topics that fall under that umbrella, but also about what community resources are, and that increasing dialogue and education will also help reduce stigma. We want our community to not only know that there is help available, but to break down some of the barriers to be able to have more of the conversations more freely. So we do continue to have sessions throughout the end of April, and already in the chat box I put some of the links to the website for ongoing registration, as well as the link for our BHCC YouTube channel where our previously recorded sessions can be found. I will quickly state that we usually get them up within about 48 hours, but on occasion it takes a little bit longer for a number of reasons. For today, and like all of our other sessions, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the questions box and ask them. Please make sure you provide context because we will ask them of the presenter at the end. So we want to make sure that there is context and relevance once that question gets posed back once he is done presenting. With that, I am really happy to introduce Kevin Richardson, and if you've watched any of our other forum sessions, you may have seen him present before or in other community presentations. So Kevin is a community resource specialist, and he is the call center program manager at Path Crisis Center, which answers about 60,000 annual calls through its 211 line, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and its own crisis line. In addition to this role, Kevin chairs the Planning and Evaluation Committee on Mid-Central Community Action's Board of Directors and serves on several local committees, including the county's Behavioral Health Priority Action Team, Mark First Human Rights Committee, and as a volunteer at Stepping Stones. His focuses are in suicide prevention, community education, and community resources. And he is absolutely that. He is a wealth of information and shares it wherever he goes. So I will hand it over to Kevin and allow him to move forward with this morning's presentation.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Tricia. So yes, today I'm going to talk about suicide prevention. And so you'll see throughout the presentation, it's going to be starting with data. It's where we should probably always be starting. And then what can we actually do ourselves, both in our general everyday life as practitioners, as whatever that might be, as our role in the community. What can we do to help prevent suicide? And so I will just go ahead and get started. I want to make sure if I hit that arrow that it goes. Okay, perfect. So like I said, let's look at the issue first from a national scope. And so just to toss some numbers out there, in 2019, we just got these numbers within the past couple months from the CDC. In 2019, 47,511 people died by suicide, in the United States. And this was actually a 2.1% decline from the 2018 numbers, where we had over 48,000 people die by suicide. And that's the first national decline in over a decade, I think in 13 years. However, this reduction in deaths was almost entirely among white Americans, with no change in suicide rates among any other racial or ethnic groups. And it is worth noting, I'm going to talk about the trend over the past 20 years, but it is worth noting, one dip in suicides in 1 year, anyone will tell you when you're talking about data over a long period of time, 1 year doesn't mean a whole lot as opposed to the 33% increase in suicide rate that we've seen over 20 years. So it might be good news, but it will be very telling what happens in 2020, where we'll probably almost certainly see another dip, but then another rise in 2021 is what people are speculating. Usually when you see a big crisis type thing, there is actually a dip in things. And then after some time, so moving it to the end of 2020 and 2021, where things have settled and anxiety and depression has gone up, we're probably going to see another rise. Rates were highest among American Indian and Alaskan Native people. So about 22.5 deaths per 100,000. And the highest rate in 2019 by age group was with older adults, age 85 and older. Firearms continue to account for over half of the suicide deaths, 50.4%. And suicide overall is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. It's the second leading cause of death among those aged 10 to 34. So myself as a 29-year-old individual, chances are if I die, it was either an accident, that's the first leading cause of death, or I killed myself. And so that kind of puts that into perspective. There are some reports that 41% of transgender individuals attempt suicide compared to about 5% of the general public. So when you're looking at specific, populations like the LGBTQ population, veterans, people who are survivors of sexual assault, what have you, there are some pretty distinct correlations with victims and suicide rates, or people who are in specific populations. And over the past 2 decades, like I mentioned, there has been a 33% increase. So from 1999 to 2019, the latest year that we have this data, there has been an increase in suicide rate. So to look at that a little more clearly, here is a little picture that I will talk a bit about. The suicide rate in the darker areas are higher. That's where we've seen the most increase. And then in the lighter areas, that's where we've seen the least increase. The only state over the past 20 years, and this map only depicts, I guess, the last 17 years from 99 to 2016. I could not find another map from 2019 that depicted this, but same sort of deal. And actually the rate went higher up from 2016 to 2019. Is Nevada. Nevada was the only place that had a decline, and it had a less than 1% decrease. So relatively insignificant among the rest of the states, with pretty significant increases. You're talking up to 58% increases in places like Montana, Wyoming. And so some other important notes about this is gun death rates are very correlative to the suicide rate. So when you look at Montana, you look at Idaho, you look at Wyoming, Utah, these are actually where you see the greatest gun ownerships as well. And over 60% of gun deaths in the United States are suicides. I think when you see guns in the media, we're mostly talking about homicides, school shootings, things like that. But really, guns are responsible for more suicides than they are homicides and whatnot. But you don't see a whole lot of that in the media. And our gun death rate is much higher than in other countries. So Japan, you have a rate of 0.2. In the UK, you have a rate of 0.3 deaths per 100,000 people. Germany, it's 0.9. Canada, it's 2.1. Whereas in the US, it's 12. So you're talking more than tenfold, increase of gun deaths. And we have a lot of guns in the US. And that doesn't mean get rid of all the guns, but it does mean let's include suicide and safety planning and whatnot when we're talking about guns on the kind of national scope. And so I thought that's a good point worth making. Now let's look at the more local scope of the issue. So McLean County data. I just got this data this week from the coroner. In 2019, McLean County had 18 total deaths by suicide. In 2020, McLean County had 23 total deaths by suicide. To put this into perspective, the youngest person was 10 years old who died by suicide. The oldest person was 93 years old. This affects everyone. Primarily in our county, we're seeing white, non-Hispanic males. That's certainly the highest rate. And we do have a relatively low amount of veterans compared to national statistics. So over these past 2 years, data showed that only 2 veterans had died by suicide in McLean County, which performs a little better than, again, nationally. And February and December have our highest amounts of suicide over the past 5 years. So that's where you're seeing the highest rates of suicide in McLean County, at least. So what do these numbers mean? I like to put some of this stuff into perspective, because 47,511, what exactly, how can we picture that? And so again, 47,511 people died by suicide in the United States. For every person who dies by suicide, data suggests that there are at least 25 other people who make an attempt, likely more. Most of this stuff is underreported, including the suicide rate themselves, and there are different reasons for that I will discuss. The data continues to tell us that there are much more people who had serious thoughts of suicide. So they had serious thoughts, but they did not make an attempt. They had serious thoughts, but they did not die by suicide. And we're talking about 12 million people annually in the United States. And so this graphic on the right, it's sort of showing all of the scope of that. And so 12 million people annually thinking about suicide seriously, not just like passive thoughts, like seriously thinking about it. 3.5 million make suicide plans, and then 1.4 million people actually attempt, and like we know, 47,511 people actually die by suicide. And so I hope that kind of outlines the seriousness of the issue. Against the 10th leading cause of death compared to other leading causes of death across the United States, suicide and mental health in general receive dramatically lower funding. And so, again, there are lots of reasons for these suicide rates, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But I just want to emphasize how big of an issue and a public health issue that this is. So the conclusion is there are a hell of a lot of people affected by suicide every day. I don't think you can make the argument that that is not the case, right? A lot of people are affected, and then think of all the loved ones, the family members of the people who do die by suicide. They are also affected by a very specific kind of grief that comes with all of this, and we need to provide those folks support as well. And so that begs the question, why is there such a problem with suicide? Why are so many people affected? Why are so many people killing themselves? And the simple conclusion is there is no single cause of suicide. It's a very unique issue. It's a very holistic issue. We see things in the media often where it has to do with bullying or mental illness, and it very much does. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's not caused by any one issue. People can kill themselves without having gone through bullying, without going through divorce. It's not caused by money issues. It's not caused by mental illness, even though people who kill themselves, 50% of them have likely depression or another diagnosable mental illness. It's not caused by drugs or addiction. It's not caused by guns, living in rural communities where we see those higher suicide rates. And it's not caused by stigma. We do want to talk more about stigma, but all of these things are certainly contributing factors. And so they're all worth mentioning. But again, someone can go through all of these and not kill themselves, or someone can go through none of these and kill themselves. And I think we need to keep that in perspective. It's a very holistic issue again. But stigma is this very particular thing that you've probably heard about, that we want to talk a little more about, and with suicide in particular. And so stigma, it refers to negative, unfair beliefs about a group. That would be the general definition of stigma. Stigma about mental health is widespread. There are stereotypes and labels, there's judgment, there's bullying, there is discrimination among people who are experiencing mental health issues, behavioral health issues, whatever that might be. And stigma prevents people from reaching out for and receiving help. This is a statistic that blows my mind every time that I share it. So the average delay between when people first experience mental health symptoms, like a mental illness, and starting that treatment is 8 to 10 years. 8 to 10 years. I mean, so imagine you broke your arm, or you were experiencing very severe chest pain, and you're like, you know what, I don't think I need to see anyone. I'll work my way through this one. And chances are, say you break your arm and you wait 8 years to receive treatment, your arm is literally going to be deformed after that. It's going to heal incorrectly. You wait 8 years to get your very severe chest pain explored and evaluated by a doctor. You might have a heart attack by that point. You might have a more serious heart disease issue, whatever that might be. Yet when it comes to mental health, the average delay between experiencing your first symptoms, whether it's you can't get out of bed, or you're feeling extremely anxious about something, it's 8 to 10 years before you receive treatment. And stigma is a very contributing factor. I mean, we've all seen some of this in our lives. I think of some of the very basic stereotypes that I saw growing up that I still continue to see. Just for example, those crazy people on the streets, those crazy homeless people. We don't know what to do with them. Don't talk to them. That sort of thing. And clearly, that is an incorrect evaluation of what's going on. That's a person who's struggling, who probably didn't receive treatment for something, and we should very much be including them in treatments and welcoming them and providing for them, because it could very well be the situation that they're a person who, had you been in the same circumstances, you could be in their position. And so without this help, people may feel unable to cope, which increases their risk for suicide. And so for me, I approach this, I start general, and then I get very specific on what can we do. And I think there are some things that we can start doing right now. Literally at the end of this presentation, you can go out, rather than even reaching out to someone who you feel like might be struggling. This is just something that we can all, as a population, do to help. And that's just be very mindful of our language when we're discussing suicide and mental health. So there is a movement among suicidologists and people in general, where we grew up, all we've heard, right, is commit suicide. People commit suicide. That actually comes from back when suicide was illegal. And if someone commits suicide, then their loved ones wouldn't be able to take out a life insurance plan for them and receive compensation for that. And so committing suicide was an illegal act. It's no longer illegal in the US. It's illegal in several countries across the world, but not in the US. It has this negative connotation when you hear people commit suicide, like they committed this heinous crime, right? People commit arson, they commit murder, but people who die by suicide, which is the language that we should be using, these are people who are suffering. They didn't do a crime, they didn't do anything to hurt you. They were struggling and they ended up dying by suicide. So again, instead of threatening suicide, which makes it more about you, like this person's doing something to me, we would use more neutral language, like thinking about suicide, or they have a plan to kill themselves. Instead of a failed attempt or an unsuccessful suicide, again, the more neutral alternative is just they attempted to end their life. You can't swing that anyway. This wasn't, I think, a failed attempt. It implies choice as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Are people who are suffering and see no way out, are they really experiencing a matter of choice here? And instead of, this is more along the lines of mental health as opposed to suicide, but instead of she is a schizophrenic, she is a person with schizophrenia. The way we discuss suicide I feel like it affects the stigma that many people experiencing suicidal thoughts feel. And with our language, we can unconsciously create an us versus them rhetoric, and it affects how we treat others. So I look to that last point. Think about it. Rather than trying to treat all of the schizophrenics, we should be trying to treat all of the people with schizophrenia. The schizophrenics, when we classify them, that like there's something that's different. There's something that we know what's best for them, as opposed to people with schizophrenia who, given the right circumstances, could have been us or will be us in the future. And I think it's important to realize that we are all human and we are all in this together. And actually, on the bottom right of every slide, that's the slogan for the forum. I just kind of realized that. So we're all in this together, right? It's not us versus them. It's not we're trying to figure out what's best for this group of people. It's we're all in this together. So when we're talking about suicide in general, so like I said, on this slide, this is stuff that we can all do right now. But what about when we're working with people or seeing this in ourselves or seeing this in our friends or family, that sort of thing? So there are some certain warning signs, and then I'm going to talk about what can we do when we see these warning signs. Feeling alone, hopeless, helpless, empty, desperate, trapped, feeling like a burden to others, talking, writing, or drawing about death, looking for ways to hurt or kill oneself, increased use of drugs or alcohol, giving away possessions, sudden agitation or anger, dramatic change in mood. And so you see a lot of these symptoms and things that have nothing to do with suicide as well. I think those first 3 points in particular, first 4 points in particular, that's where you're seeing very specifically something having to do with suicide. But all of these could be warning signs. But now, especially in times of COVID, where we aren't seeing people in person as much, it's like, what else can you sort of look for? And so I threw together a little slide here after looking some stuff up and seeing some stuff working on the crisis hotline myself. So changes in tone, language, and time of day when people are texting, talking, or posting online. For instance, the middle of the night can be a cause for concern. Like if someone in the past, this isn't where they, traditionally had been posting on Facebook or reaching out to you. You wake up to a 2 a.m. text from your friend or a call that you'd missed because you were sleeping. This can be a cause for concern because disruption of sleep can also worsen suicidal behavior, tiredness, what have you. That makes everything worse. Increased feelings of isolation, and they can lead to a reliance on substance use as well. The frequency in which a person answers calls or texts, like were they someone that used to respond really quickly and all the time, and now they're just not so much? That could just mean they're busy, of course, but a trend of sorts may tell you, hey, maybe I want to check in on my friend, right? Changes in the frequency and content of what they might be sharing online, or if they share media links with you. This behavior can show what information is central to their view and to their surroundings and whatnot. And so if you are seeing some of these warning signs, what should you do? Well, I'm going to get into that, but I'd want to start with some myths and then what the actual facts are. And so I have a couple myths about suicidality and whatnot, and in generally thinking about the question, what should you do? There's a myth out there that asking about suicide actually implants the idea into people's heads and puts them at risk. Again, that's a myth. And there's another myth that most suicides happen suddenly and without warning. Like you couldn't have seen this coming. I think I used to see this in the media more often than I do now, but they were the happiest person on the surface. We had no idea. And that can certainly be the case for some folks. But statistically speaking, generally speaking, that's not the case. There were some warning signs, and it's important to know what those are, right? So what are the facts as opposed to those myths? So asking about suicide empathetically gets the topic out there, and it empowers people to open up about what is typically very difficult to discuss. You aren't implanting an idea, you're actually showing that you care enough to ask someone. It's very important that we do ask people that directly. And then most suicides, again, had distinct warning signs prior to them occurring and are preventable. And again, this is the whole kind of crux of this topic. They are preventable, and we can do things to prevent them, both from a public health perspective and just as ourselves as human beings working with people. So what should we do? First and foremost, the answer is listen. Listen to people when they are struggling, when they're going through something hard. Listen to them. Don't talk. And so he's covering his mouth like this. Listen. People need to be heard. People need to be validated. And that is ultimately what is most important. And so I want to share a quote on suicide. You're about to see a wall of text, and I apologize for the wall of text, and we'll read the wall of text. It's by David Foster Wallace. He actually, if you aren't familiar, he, is actually grew up local, grew up in the Peoria area, moved away for a bit, ended up teaching at ISU. He was an English professor. He's a famous author, and he struggled with depression, different sorts of mental illness his entire life. And he ended up dying by suicide as well. He's written things, ooh, it's so early right now. I'm trying to think of the names of actually even where this quote is from that I'm about to share. It'll come to me. But this Infinite Jests, that's where this comes from. It was actually based a lot of influence in the Peoria area. So that's one of his largest works, one of his most recognized works. He's an extremely wordy guy, which is why this quote is so long, but very interesting. He's got some great stuff out there. I would recommend. And so this quote, I'll explain why I'm sharing it after I read it. So he writes, the so-called psychotically depressed person who tries to kill herself doesn't do so out of, quote, hopelessness or any abstract conviction that life's assets and debits do not square, and surely not because death seems suddenly appealing. The person in whom its invisible agony reaches a certain unendurable level will kill herself the same way a trapped person who will eventually jump from the window of a burning high-rise. Make no mistake about people who leap from burning windows. Their terror of falling from a great height is still just as great as it would be for you or me standing speculatively at the same window, just checking out the view, i.e. the fear of falling remains constant. The variable here is the other terror, the fire's flames. When the flames get close enough, falling to death becomes the slightly less terrible of two terrors. It's not desiring the fall, it's terror of the flames. And yet nobody down on the sidewalk looking up and yelling, don't, and hang on, can understand the jump. Not really. You'd have to have personally been trapped and felt flames to really understand a terror way beyond falling. And so for me, someone who himself does not struggle with suicidal thoughts, but has certainly worked with, at this point, thousands of people who have worked or who do experience suicidal thoughts, and having several friends and family members and whatnot who struggle with this sort of thing. I think this quote does a great job of enlightening us, the helpers who may not have experienced something like this, and to help empathize with individuals who are experiencing a suicidal crisis. It's not that people want to die, it's that they want to escape the suffering, right? It's not that they want to jump off the building, it's that they need to get away from the flames, and there is no other choice. If I was facing either flames or jumping off a building, I'm going to jump off the building every single time, right? So they're experiencing a suffering way beyond our current ability to understand, because we're down here on the street, unable to feel what they're feeling. And so I think, again, it just does a great job of keeping empathy at our core as helpers, and when we're listening to people and what we do to intervene to help. So I've got a list of different things that we should be doing, both as practitioners, as friends, and even as people that are potentially advising, law or, whatever it might come to, policies on things like this. So active listening, empathize and validate actively and frequently. Someone's talking to you and you say, I can't imagine what this has been like for you. I'd probably be thinking the same way if I was you. What you're dealing with is extremely difficult. You're reflecting their emotions. And so say they say something like, everything keeps going downhill. I lost my job, then I lost my uncle, and now it feels like I'm about to lose my relationship. A good way to show that you are actively listening, to validate would be to say something like, it must feel like things won't get better. That's a dreadful feeling. And then they might respond with something like, exactly, it's like it will never end. And so you help people know that they're not alone by offering a listening and empathetic ear and by validating what they're going through. On the opposite end, here's what you probably shouldn't be doing. So you want to steer clear of cliches. So don't say things like, everything will be okay, you're going to get through this, just stay positive. These all come from a place of compassion. I understand that, but they're very, honestly, if you look at it, they're very empty, unhelpful statements. They don't have any basis in what they're actually going through. We cannot back up that everything's going to be okay. Honestly, everything's probably going to suck for a bit, right? And that's the honest truth. But at least they know that when you say, like, wow, that is really difficult, at least they know that they're being heard and that you seem to understand what they're going through, as opposed to, well, don't worry, just stay positive, you'll get through this. You're disregarding what they're feeling, right? And so you want to say things like, I know things are really difficult right now, but it doesn't always have to be this way. You're so strong to have gotten through everything so far. That is a typo. I shouldn't have included just stay positive. I copied that down to the do say. Luckily, it's still in red, so don't say just stay positive. And what else should you do? So we should ask directly. So we talked about the warning signs, right? We're empathizing with them, we're reflecting, we're validating. Earlier, I had mentioned that they said, exactly, it's like it will never end. I'll go back to that slide real quick so we understand what I'm referencing. At the very end, you said, it must feel like things won't get better. That's a dreadful feeling. Exactly, it's like it will never end. So now we're getting to a point where, okay, they said it's like it will never end. What exactly do you mean by that? Are you thinking about suicide? So they say, exactly, it's like it will never end. Sometimes, you respond, when it feels like things are so hopeless, it's hard not to think about giving up. Are you thinking about suicide right now? And with this question that you asked very directly, there are some follow-up questions. Have you thought about suicide recently in the last 2 months? This will help you gauge, and you don't have to ask that back to back, but this will help you gauge how long this has been an issue and therefore how much this person may be hurting right now. And do you have a plan for how you would die? This will help gauge how much this person is seriously and actively thinking about ending their life. Someone with a plan is at much more risk than someone with simple passive thoughts of suicide. Like, I've thought about it, but I don't want to kill myself. I haven't, even thought about how I would do it. That's much less risk than someone who says, yeah, I'm going to grab my gun tomorrow and I'm going to do it, right? And so that kind of gauges some risk for us. And I want to emphasize this point. Don't be afraid to ask the question. It's one of the most important things we can do with people who are experiencing these struggles and whatnot. Are you thinking about suicide right now? That is the simple question that we can ask. You're not thinking of suicide, right? Right? That's sort of a leading question. You don't want to ask it in such a way. You want to ask it very directly. Are you thinking about suicide right now? As opposed to, I think what I see often when we're training individuals here to answer for our crisis hotline is we try to beat around the bush, and that's a result of our society and being this topic being so stigmatized and whatnot. We don't really know how to talk about it very well, very comfortably, but really we're just talking to a human being and we're empathizing with them in the same way that you would want to be empathized with. And so as opposed to saying you're not thinking about suicide, right, which kind of forces the answer like, oh, no, of course I'm not thinking about suicide. If they're not thinking about suicide, great. You move on with the conversation and you continue to be an empathetic person and someone who's going to help. But if so, now you're on the same page and you can talk about the topic openly and non-judgmentally. You can talk about this directly. Like, this is exactly what we're talking about, as opposed to what are we even talking about here? Are you going to kill yourself? So it's very important that we ask it, and we ask it directly. We can't know if we don't ask. People tend to beat around the bush again because the topic is so heavily stigmatized. But remember, you're not implanting the idea into someone's mind by asking. You're showing that you care enough to ask. We're about 2/3 of the way through. just so everyone is aware. So what should you do? Again, so in addition to listening, in addition to being a good person, someone who's going to listen empathetically, who's going to provide support and whatnot, who's going to ask directly, we should connect people with help. And that can mean a lot of different things based on the situation, right? So of course, I gave ourselves here at PATH Crisis Center a shout out. You can call a resource like PATH if you genuinely aren't comfortable or know what to do, or you're blanking on what to do. We're trained on how to help with this sort of thing. So you can dial 211 to reach us, and then that's our toll-free number. Or you can have the person who you're concerned about call if they're open to it. We're available 24/7. It's confidential. We provide further resources as well. But there's other resources out there, specifically in McLean County too. So the Center for Human Services, that's CHS's crisis team, or the Crisis Residential Unit at Chestnut. You can accompany people to the McLean County Triage Center. If possible, it's important that you stay with the person until help arrives, especially if it's a little more serious or they are safe. And that means we safety plan with individuals. In general, you want to explore resources for treatment. Suicidality, it's very up and down. One day people can be feeling pretty good, and then the next day or a trigger happens and they're not feeling as well, and they might need a little more help, right? So we want to explore resources for treatment. Do they already have a counselor that they can see soon? A lot of times people, again, this is a relatively chronic thing that they're going through, and so they talk with their counselor, maybe not specifically about the suicidality, but about their depression or anxiety and whatnot, and now it's just expanded to that. Are they open to a support group? That could be another option. And so I want to talk a little bit about the specific resources, and then I'll kind of double back on what else we can do. One of those resources is crisis team intervention. I think we're very blessed in McLean County to have a 24/7 crisis team that is mobile. And so in general, crisis teams, there is one in almost every single county in Illinois. I think there's literally 2 counties that don't have an active crisis team, but they still have ways on how they handle this. But in general, crisis teams, they have people who can assist in a greater capacity than maybe a crisis hotline can. And sometimes they're one and the same, but it's available 24/7. And in McLean County, we have a mobile unit that can meet people at their homes, hospitals, jails, neutral locations. They actually still do most of their work over the phone, especially during the pandemic, but they have this mobile capability, and oftentimes they are visiting people at the hospital or even the triage center, the jails, neutral locations. And so again, mobile unit locally, they aim for the least invasive intervention possible. And that's very important when you're talking about suicide. We don't want to further traumatize people who are going through a terrible thing, right? I think generally speaking, we grow up knowing call 911 for an emergency. And then it gets a little cloudier when you start talking about mental health emergencies, right? And this, my friend is seeing things and I don't know exactly what to do. Should I call 911? I don't want him, like, he's not a criminal, right? What's going on here? And so one thing I've seen in the media, and it's been both good and bad. I wrestle with this. I've seen it in the media, like we should fund more of this and we should be doing this, and this is a revolutionary idea. And it's like, it's something that actually mostly already exists, and certainly it needs more funding. I would agree with that. But to act as if this is a revolutionary idea that we have social workers go out to people's homes instead of police, that's not a new idea. This is something that our county has been doing for quite a while. And I think the nation in general, we have a tough time transitioning because, again, it's just in our heads, call 911 for an emergency. But you can call 211 to get in touch with our local crisis team. That'll reach PATH Crisis Center first, and we'll get you in touch. But they provide a full mental health assessment, and it depends on the situation. The person might have to go to the hospital first, but certainly it can prevent a costly hospital visit. It can prevent those sirens from coming down the road and people who are already feeling suicidal, now they have to get into a cop car, right? And feel like they're a criminal and whatnot. And they offer follow-up as well. So it's extremely important that we're aware of these resources. There is one serving, like I said, every county typically. In McLean County, we have a bunch of resources, non-crisis counseling resources, other behavioral health services. And so, like it says here, there are many agencies in McLean County that offer counseling services or similar behavioral health services, including some agencies already discussed. Center for Human Services, they have their own therapy program as well as other things. You can get their information directly. You can call 211 again to reach us. We have a database, or you can go online at findhelp211.org. It's a little difficult to navigate. I'd encourage you to call 211, but that option is there. And so we're talking different things like ABC counseling, collaborative solutions, NAMI, Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. There's a national crisis text line, Agape counseling, integrity counseling, Lutheran child and family services, heart-to-heart support services. There are a lot more out there, right? In general, there are other crisis lines. So I've alluded to PATH several times because that's where I work. It's where I do most of my things. But you can dial 211 to reach us. You can also, we opened up texting during business hours. You can text your 5-digit zip code to 898-211. We hope this will reach a younger population, and we're going to be doing some more marketing on that after we've done more training ourselves here and gotten our volunteers and staff on board with that. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, that's available nationally. You've probably seen that a little bit in the news as well if you've paid attention to suicide prevention news. Currently, you reach it by dialing 800-273-TALK or 800-SUICIDE. They do have a veterans line as well, so if you dial that number and then press 1 for veterans, that is available. But in the news, we had some bills, some legislation passed, and so they are mandating that we create a 3-digit zip code. It's going to be a 3-digit number, not a zip code, to dial, just like 211 or 911. It's going to be 988. Please don't direct people to dial 988 right now. Currently, it needs to be the FCC. They're requiring that all phone providers and whatnot make that available by June 2022, I believe is the date. So chances are if you dial 988 right now, you're not going to get anyone. So continue to give out that 800-273-TALK. Locally, we actually answer for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline here at PATH. We answer for 9 counties in central Illinois. And so if you were to dial that locally, you would reach us. If you dial that somewhere else, you're going to reach a different crisis hotline. That's how those work. They have 40-something different answering centers that answer for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The Trevor Project, that's a good option for the LGBTQ population. And so the Trevor Lifeline, that's also available 24/7. Again, I talked about how specifically people who identify as trans, they have a much higher suicide rate and a much higher attempt rate than others because they're going through so many specific issues societally and personally in their lives that people tend not to be as accepting of in society. And so with that comes their own issues, and so that's why there is that specific line. So I would keep that in your back pocket. Warm lines in general, they are answered by people who experience mental health issues themselves or have in the past, and they themselves answer these lines. These vary by area. We don't have a specific one answering for McLean County right now, but if literally you Google Illinois warm lines, you'll pull up some. So there are other forms of crisis intervention as well. I alluded to the triage center. This is this relatively new service that we offer in McLean County, where it is open daily from 7:30 a.m. until 3 a.m. So they're only closed from 3 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. It's walk-in for anyone over age 18 experiencing a behavioral health crisis, a non-life-threatening behavioral health crisis, I should note. If it is more life-threatening, then usually crisis team gets involved or what have you. But they're located at 200 West Front Street. It's the health department building, and again, it's walk-in. So it offers an alternative to the hospital, which again can be expensive, costly. I believe the police direct people to the triage center often as well. Tricia might be able to attest a little more to that. But the crisis residential unit at Chestnut, that's also available. So it's 24/7. They have a phone line that you can talk to them on as well. But it also offers sort of a step down from the hospital. The hospital, if you get admitted into the hospital, it's usually involuntary, where you're threatening someone or yourself, and you can't, we can't make sure that that situation is safe. And so then there's an involuntary hospitalization. Whereas someone who's just struggling and they don't want to struggle anymore, you know, there's something like the residential unit, which is available 24/7 if beds are open. And typically they do have beds open. So it's voluntary. There are other resources out there as well. So just general counseling options. I mentioned those a couple of slides ago. You can dial 211. And there are so many different resources available. Whether you have, you know, insurance through your work, in which case I would just say get in touch with your insurance to see what's available to you. Or say you're on Medicaid or Medicare. We have all of those things. Or say you don't have any health insurance at all. There are options for you out there. Support groups, that might be another step down. Like maybe you didn't have a good experience with a counselor, or the person you're concerned about, they refuse to see a counselor. Are they open to a support group? There are also survivor of suicide support groups. So what that means is someone who has lost a loved one to suicide, they call that a survivor of suicide. And so those support groups exist. I think locally right now that's being offered through ABC counseling. And so again, you experience a very specific kind of grief when you lose someone to suicide. And so it's important that we, you know, can provide support in that way. I always say, don't forget general referrals, and this is my 211 mind kind of functioning here, that help with the situation. I talk about 211 and our crisis line in general is going hand in hand with the suicide hotline, right? So 211 is available for health and human services. We just offer a listening ear, but we connect you with things like rent assistance, food pantries, low-cost car repair, a counselor, whatever it might be, any sort of nonprofit health or human service that you're looking for. And you can imagine, I mean, especially right now during the pandemic, when people are still struggling so much financially, and it's unclear, like, how long is this moratorium on evictions going to last, or the moratorium on utility shutoffs and whatnot, and what's going to happen when everyone suddenly has to pay back some of these things that they literally still cannot afford. We've gotten some stimulus checks, but it's certainly not enough for the people who are already struggling the most. And I can imagine if I was in that position, if I lost my job, if I lost my relationship suddenly, if I lost a loved one to COVID, I would be very different feeling than I'm feeling right now. And so talking to someone on 211 is very similar to talking to someone who is just thinking about suicide in general, and that you're talking to a person who's struggling. And so don't forget, there are very real problems that can be treated with concrete things like food pantries, rent assistance, utility assistance, again, these things. And so I think it's really important as helpers or even as friends, you know, you can call on behalf, you can encourage them to call and say that, you know, there is help out there potentially for you. And so just keep that in mind. Trusted individuals, I can't emphasize this enough. If someone is coming to you, you are clearly that trusted individual if they're talking about this with you. But there are other resources in people's lives. You can't take responsibility for people, but you can be someone who is there when they need you. So whether it's a close family member, a friend, a religious leader, a mentor, a group sponsor, maybe they're part of like AA or something like that, someone that someone feels comfortable going to if they're going through this. That would be the biggest thing. I had someone ask me, I go climbing at the Proving Ground. It's a local bouldering gym. And we were talking about our work, and he ended up asking me as a doctor, you know, what's the one thing that you would suggest to a kid or even an adult, to, you know, someone who is thinking about suicide? What would you suggest? And my suggestion, and this is a very kind of general suggestion, is talk to someone who you trust, who will listen to you, And whether that is a trusted individual or that's going to be a hotline of sorts, it helps to know that you're not alone, right? And so I can't emphasize that point enough. So finally, what should you do with people who are, or what should you do as a helper? If someone reached out to you and they were seeking help, do them a favor and reach back out within a couple of days. That's something that we do as an answer for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That, like I mentioned, that's something the crisis team does as well. We follow up with people, especially when someone has gotten to a point where now they've started expressing this, right? And it's already tough, we know, in society to express that they're thinking about suicide. Now we're at a point where we are expressing that. That's very vulnerable. It's very difficult. And so we can help and let them know that that was the right thing to do by following up. And so this reinforces that this was a positive thing to reach out and that you actually care about them and the outcome of the situation, right? This may seem counterintuitive, but people are statistically at higher risk for a suicide attempt shortly after receiving care. And this is likely it's because those who seek and receive care are inherently at higher risk. So, someone who isn't going to seek care probably didn't need to seek care in the first place, right? But I just want to emphasize the point. It's important that we're looking out for each other, right? And that we are following up. And again, statistically, if you were to go to the hospital, you would think, okay, well, now you've received treatment, you're gonna get some help now. It doesn't mean that the hospital isn't necessarily doing their job or a counselor isn't necessarily doing their job. It's that these people are at inherently higher risk because by virtue of going to the hospital, right? And so just think about it that way. And it's very important that we follow up and we do our part. And so research shows, at least in a crisis line setting, that following up improves the chances of following through with a care plan by up to 70%. So there's statistics backing this up as well. In general, I have some more points. We're wrapping up here. How to help. So I talked about reducing stigma by talking openly about mental health. Pay attention to the warning signs. Share concerns with your loved ones. Don't stay quiet. If you're concerned about someone, let them know. That's a friendly thing to do. And if it ends up being the case that they're okay, then great. They're okay. There's nothing wrong with that, right? I think especially today, as we're seeing, more communication through social media, through texting, less in person, whatnot, we build up in our head more of a struggle in just simply talking with people about things that shouldn't be that hard to talk about, and just saying to someone that you care about them and you just want to check in and say you're okay. I actually had a buddy just reach out recently who actually used to volunteer here at PATH. We had a Facebook group and he just randomly messaged. He was like, send at least a 100-word essay on how you've been doing since you all left the hotline. And so there was a few of us in there. And one of them I'm close with, I see, multiple times a week. And my answer was, well, I haven't left the hotline yet. I'm still here and kicking. But it was nice. I think about him every now and then, and for him to reach out like that, it's a good thing. And so, again, just reaching out to people, it wasn't even like showing that he was concerned. He's just like, hey, how are you guys doing? And it's a great thing to do. You can get certified in mental health first aid. The county provides that. And you can find that on their website, or youth mental health first aid. It's a great one-day training that you can do to, get a little more acquainted. You can also support agencies that improve mental health by donating or volunteering your time. So, for example, PATH, we offer training for volunteers to help answer our crisis hotline 3 times each year. You can certainly reach out to me if you're interested in that. It is a bit of a commitment, but it's certainly worth it. You can share information about resources with your friends, with your family, with your community members, in whatever role that you serve. It's important that you know some of these things. And you can make an active effort, again, to avoid stigmatizing language, saying died by suicide as opposed to commit suicide, as opposed to saying those crazy people on the streets, right? Which would be a big no-no. Don't say that. It's, you know, that person's struggling, right? That person might need some help, right? And so it's an active effort that we can do to avoid stigmatizing language, and that will help society in the long run. And so my big conclusion and takeaway: lots and lots of people have thoughts of suicides. The stats don't lie, especially people in crisis or in need of resources, especially people who are already experiencing, you know, mental health issues and whatnot. It's okay, and frankly, it's encouraged to bring up the topic and to ask the question, are you thinking about suicide? Anytime you have an inkling that this might be the case, you're showing that you care. Suicidality is a complex subject with lots of moving parts, but the best thing that we can do is offer a helping hand, let people know that we're listening, listen to them first. They're people that you could be in the same position with should you have faced this, you know, the same circumstances. With this minimal training, this blows my mind a little bit too. You're now one of just over 50% of behavioral health specialists, even though people who are watching, you might not be a behavioral health specialist, who have formal suicide training. There are some statistics out there that this is improving a bit, but if you actually look at curriculum sometimes for mental health specialists in graduate school and whatnot, suicide might be a topic that is covered, but there's not a full class on that's covered. And with something that is so heavily emphasized and so heavily a part of our society, 47,000 people, 10th leading cause of death, second leading cause of death among youth up to age 34. You would think this would be a little more heavily in curriculums and trainings and whatnot. So now you're one of just over 50% of people who have had this training in the behavioral health field. Connect people to longer term resources. Suicidality, it's ongoing. It doesn't just go away. I kind of think of it in the same way, like domestic violence. It doesn't tend to just go away. Oftentimes people, there are 7 incidents on average of domestic violence before you can get out of that situation. It's because there's so many moving parts and there's so many vulnerabilities for victims and people who are feeling this way and whatnot. And so it's just important to keep in mind, connect people to longer term resources, continue to be a friend and whatnot. And that is all I've got. So thank you. I think it just hit 8:30, which hopefully is perfect timing. So any questions, comments, concerns? I don't know if Tricia, you had anything to add, but.
Well, I will remind folks, and knowing that we had a few who jumped on after I shared this at the beginning, but if you have any questions or comments for Kevin, feel free to put them in the questions box or the chat feature, either one, and I'll post them to him. I will comment and say I really appreciated that quote from David Foster Wallace, because I think it can help any of us who have not experienced that desire for suicidality, that we ourselves have felt those flames to take a different step. And so I think that made it, I mean, not only ties into the empathy, but made it relatable to understand in a much better sense. I think so many people are visual, and I think that added a visual component in addition to a situation that we can all empathize and relate with. And I'm with you. I'm pretty sure if I were in a burning building, I would jump out of the window.
Yeah.
Probably each and every time, because that slight chance of surviving but breaking a leg seems like a better risk than feeling those flames.
Absolutely.
And I also want to just say thank you that you took one, not only as most recent data as you could find, but you also made sure that you had local data so that the folks watching understand what this looks like in our community, in our county. And I think, you know, so often, I mean, and so many of us as service providers always refer back to 211 because you have that connection point to everyone within the county and on a bigger scale as well. And that sometimes what people need is a tangible or concrete resource that can be a part of their solution and moving forward. And that's such a huge piece of what you guys do in addition to all of the suicide and mental health support. I don't see questions yet. Do you have anything else that you want to add or that you think all of us should know or be doing in addition to changing our language and having direct conversations along the way?
Right. Well, luckily, I think I covered most of what I wanted to cover. Just a couple other things. I don't have the link on hand, but I think there's some good other material out there. So I think to kind of emphasize the point on stigma, if that isn't clear to people, one thing that I like to share is a TED Talk. It's actually a little dated, I think, even in the TED Talk, and I forget when it's from, 2011 or 12, potentially. It's a bit dated. So some of the language that they're using is a bit dated and whatnot, but the point still stands. And it's called Confessions of a Depressed Comic, or Confessions of a Depressed Comedian. I forget his last name. His first name is Kevin. That's why I remember it. And he talks about how he's a comedian and he does stand-up comedy and whatnot, but he was suicidal and no one would have known if they were just looking at things based on his performance on a stage, right? And then he talks about the stigma of it all, and he uses some good visualizations. One that stuck with me is, when people break their arm, everyone rushes to sign the cast. But when people say that they're depressed, everyone sort of backs off and they don't know what to say. And that's the stigma, right? And so I would just say, in addition to some of the other stuff that I've said, is, do your own research too. We live in a society, and this isn't to blame anyone or anything, but we live in a society where everything is so up in our face, and literally Google, there are some documentaries out there that are frightening, are kind of telling you what to think and whatnot, and shoving things in your face based on what you've already looked at and based on what you search in Google and based on different things or you talk about in Facebook. I mean, that is literally happening on your phone. And so I think it takes us to take a little bit more of a step. And if you are interested in something, look at different sources for things, look at different resources, as opposed to what might be tossed at you, because you might not realize how big of an issue this was, and you wouldn't, and that's not your fault because you haven't been looking that up. But I think it takes us, to take that step and whatnot, and to always try to educate ourselves, and to always try to have the uncomfortable conversations and whatnot. There's nothing wrong with more education and more discourse.
I appreciate that. We did have just one comment for you, which is thank you for this knowledge and resources. Today was nice. So someone sharing their appreciation. I haven't seen anything else come through, but we'll say that all of the folks over at PATH are always incredibly helpful. So for those of you watching live, or if you end up watching this as a previously recorded version, I would say 211 and PATH are a great resource and a starting point, and we'll always connect to the appropriate place and lend an empathetic ear. So I know I always hear positive feedback, and I know that you are also one of our go-to resources for folks as well. So thank you very much for giving your time this morning. And I don't know if it's coming in early for you, but it's an early start for a lot of people, so I appreciate that. And for everyone who attended this morning, and I hope you all have a good rest of your rainy Thursday. So, all right, have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Tricia.
Mm-hmm.